Pie in the Sky Media. This series contains adult language and descriptions of graphic violence throughout. Listener discretion is advised.
So Newport is kind of like, it's been described as Beverly Hills by the sea. So it has all the money, all the fancy houses, only there's yachts there. You also have a section of Newport that it's called the Peninsula, where there's lower rent apartment buildings where surfers can live. So you've got students that are going to UCI mixed with some of the wealthiest people in the world on Lido Island and Balboa Island, and these beautiful homes with multi-million-dollar yachts. And it's this really odd mix of like bikinis and couture. You could have a Bentley at a red light right next to a broke kid with a surfboard under his arm on a bike going to the beach.
Newport Beach in California is a unique place for another reason. All that opulence on display for the world to see.
It can attract those who want to steal from those who, have a lot of money.
And even beautiful places can be touched by terrifying, real-life things that go bump in the night.
And serial killers, I don't want to take anything away from the victims on those cases that I did, because I dealt with 13 serial killers and a grand total of probably 100 murder victims in those cases. But my God, I just never seen anything like this.
Welcome back to Criminal Mischief with Carolyn and Branden. You're listening to episode 122, Wanton Cruelty. It's October 2012, and Michael's life is going great. He shares a house with his roommate Billy in Newport Beach, just a block away from the surf and sand, and he runs a successful medical marijuana dispensary business. It was after midnight on October 2nd, and Michael is getting ready for bed. His roommate Billy was out of town, but Billy's girlfriend, Mary, who'd been staying at the house, had already turned in for the night.
Mary Barnes was the girlfriend of Michael's roommate, who was out of town that weekend. And she had just moved from the East Coast to Orange County. It was like her first week, and she moved in with her boyfriend and was spending the night.
That's Matt Murphy.
I'm a former senior deputy district attorney from the Orange County DA's office and author of the Book of Murder.
Michael was asleep upstairs, had been for a couple of hours, when he was roused from a deep sleep. A noise, something unfamiliar. He was trying to suss out the origin of the sound as he, within seconds, became incrementally more conscious, then realizes he's not alone. Suddenly, he's awake, with heart-pounding fear. There's an intruder in the house, pointing a gun at him. Michael tried to push the gun away from his face, and that's when the beating began. He was cracked over the head with the butt of a shotgun and pummeled from multiple directions by feet and fists. It wasn't just one guy. It was 3 masked, armed intruders.
He's woken up being beaten with a pump-action shotgun. They came with restraints, with plastic zip ties. They somehow got into the house, which the victims did not know how that was accomplished.
Michael was then blindfolded. Duct tape was slapped across his face, and his wrists and ankles were cinched with zip ties. Immobilized, Michael was brutally dragged downstairs, and Mary, who had also been snatched out of bed, blindfolded and zip-tied too, could hear the thwap as Michael's head hit each step on the way down of the staircase. The men demanded Michael tell them where he'd stashed the $1 million. Michael said he didn't know what they were talking about. He didn't have $1 million in the house or anywhere else. Even though Mary and Michael couldn't see their intruders, their intentions became clear when they heard them rummaging throughout the house, asking Michael where he hid the money. And again, Michael tells them he doesn't have $1 million in cash, but he does have some money in a safe at his business.
It sounds like they kept repeating they thought he had $1 million.
Right. So they kept demanding $1 million, and we had no idea where that came from, and our victim had no idea where it came from. And what he kept telling them is, look, I have cash in the most logical place. I have cash in the business. I have a safe in the business. Take me there now and I'll give you every penny of it. And it wasn't $1 million, but it was, he's like, and I think he told him, I've got, I think he said either 40 or 60,000. I can't even remember. Like, I've got money in there. Let's go get it. It's yours. Just don't hurt me.
Matt says the armed intruders dragged Michael and Mary into a van and started driving. They have no idea where these men are taking them, and Mary can only listen as she sits in the back of the van near Michael, who's being beaten and tortured. She feels helpless as Michael cries out in pain as he's being tasered in between being burned with a blowtorch.
They were using fake Mexican accents, is the way they described it. And they had like corrido or mariachi music blasting on the stereo the entire time as they're torturing our male victim all the way out into the desert for hours.
As the men demand the money from Michael, insisting that he'd buried the $1 million in cash in the desert. In between the beating, the tasering, and the blowtorch to his back and sides, the men are relentless. They keep demanding the $1 million, convinced that he's buried it somewhere in the desert. Michael pleaded with them. They could have the money he had in a safe, but they don't want that. They want the $1 million.
They kept saying, fuck you, we want the $1 million. We know it's buried out here. And he, again, had no idea what they were talking about.
It felt like they'd been driving forever. But from the back of the van, based on the speed and the sound of the roadway, which had been smooth and no stops for traffic lights, to Mary, it felt like they'd been on the freeway. But then the road changed. It was bumpy, with the sound of gravel crunching beneath the tires, at least until the van came to an abrupt stop. The door to the van slid open. Mary and Michael were dragged out of the back, the men still demanding the money, telling Michael they knew he had buried the cash in the desert. When they pulled Michael, helpless, zip-tied, blindfolded, and horribly beaten and tortured, into a desert gully, his pants inadvertently slid down to his knees. Mary didn't see it, but she could hear the shift in their captors' demeanors. She was still blindfolded, so she didn't see that one of the men stood on Michael's chest. By then, Michael, what he'd already gone through that night, the relentless beating and torture over the last 2 hours, and the indignity of lying there, blindfolded in the desert, zip-tied, his pants around his legs, exposed, the full weight of one of his captors who stood on his chest. Then he felt a zip tie being tightened around the base of his penis, heard the other men chant, "Do it! Do it!" And as he feels himself being mutilated, someone sings, back and forth, and then the laughing, the sinister laughter.
One of the most horrific things I saw in 26 years as a prosecutor, that they had cut off his penis.
Michael hadn't lost consciousness, so he felt the glug, glug, glug as some kind of liquid was poured over him. He thought it was gasoline and that they were going to burn him alive. But the unmistakable smell of bleach floated in the desert air as the liquid seeped into his bare skin, his open wounds, like hellfire, forever searing the footprints from where he'd been stomped into his skin. Mary, from her position, slumped on the desert floor, heard one last thing from one of their abductors. He said to her, "I'm gonna take this and throw it, and if you can find it, you can live. Today is your lucky day." Mary heard a thunk on the ground, then the sound of footsteps as the 3 men piled back into the van, the start of the ignition, and finally, she heard gravel spitting from the back of the rear tires as they drove away. Mary's wrists and ankles were still zip-tied. She lifted her knees up to slide the blindfold up enough so she could see, and what she saw was a vast desert landscape that surrounded her. It was nearly sunrise, and she looked in the direction of where she'd heard that thunk. and there was just enough sunlight for Mary to see the glint of a knife's blade. She managed to crawl to it and somehow was able to slice through the zip ties around her ankles. Miraculously, she saw headlights in the distance, about a mile away. She knew Michael's life was in her hands. Mary sprinted past sagebrush. It was a land of desolation, a landscape of sloping hills and valleys where intermittent telephone poles seemed to go on forever. But how many cars drove through the desert on a regular basis? She had to get to that one. She just had to. It was early in the morning. The sun was just coming up, and a man was driving through the Mojave Desert on his way to work.
There's a woman who is running through the open desert in pajamas with a blindfold just up over her eyes. Her hands are still zip tied behind her back, and she manages to flag down, of all the cars, a police officer who's on his way to work, who's a sheriff's deputy in a patrol car.
Mary quickly tried to explain how she and her roommate Michael were kidnapped, that he'd been beaten and tortured and needed medical attention as soon as possible, and that despite everything that she'd been through, she would be able to lead them back to Michael.
They're able to somehow find the road that this van had taken into the desert, and they tracked him down. They found our victim, and he'd been horrifically tortured. He was still bound. He was on his side. And as they began to examine him further, they discovered that they had cut off his penis.
Michael was rushed to the hospital. And based on Mary's information that she and Michael had been kidnapped 140 miles away, that was the jurisdiction of the Newport Beach Police.
Sometimes you get crazy cases where your victim doesn't die, but you're in it because the detectives called you because it's crazy and it's heavy and they need immediate help. And I got the call from my detectives at Newport saying, we got a horrible one.
The detectives called Matt because Orange County is unique when a serious crime has been committed.
Essentially, instead of doing the assembly line, the traditional police investigate, one prosecutor looks at the case for filing, another does the preliminary hearing, somebody else does the pretrial, and then somewhere way down the chain, it winds up on the desk of somebody who's going to go try it. Instead, what they do is you get into a specialized unit like sexual assault or homicide, and you're assigned a patch. You're assigned a section of the county that's automatically going to be yours for that type of case. So for 2002 to 2019, I was the homicide deputy assigned to Newport Beach, Costa Mesa, Laguna, and Irvine. So that way the police, there's no middleman. The police can reach out directly to their assigned deputy if it's something really heavy. And that way you immediately get the call, you go to the crime scene typically, especially on the murders. I'd roll out in the middle of the night with my investigator, and you're there to assist the police in search warrants and things like that as they conduct their investigation. And then you do every part of the case. You decide when there's enough evidence, you file charges, you decide who there's enough evidence against, what charges to file, who to make deals with, if you need to roll somebody in a conspiracy, for example, and you kind of go all the way up the chain, all the way through the jury trial and sentencing. The case is yours for all purposes.
As it would turn out, this kind of camaraderie has been critical in solving cases.
If you win a few cases for a department and you work with the same detectives over and over again, they tend to trust you a lot more. And so when you say, hey, we need more probable cause for that warrant, or we need more investigation on this person, it works better. Everybody wins because the cases tend to be more complete, the investigations tend to be more thorough, and you tend to catch the bad guys a lot more often.
Because it sounds like it really becomes a team sport as opposed to an individual game. Because a lot of times in the detectives I've talked to, and there seems to be this is total overgeneralization, but like detectives are like, we didn't have enough to charge, the prosecutor wouldn't do it. But it seems like you're like, hey, this is what we need, and we just need a little bit more. And that kind of has a different vibe to it than like you being the person to put the kibosh on all this hard work that is that the camaraderie that you're talking about that's developed?
That's exactly right. On the really heavy stuff, on rapes, child molests, and especially murders, you have a real interactive process where the DA will be at the police department going through the evidence with the detective. So it's more of a dialogue, and you let them know, and as an attorney, the idea is you've got the legal knowledge and you have the experience. And I mean, before you get to homicide, I think I had 80 jury trials under my belt before I went in there. And so you have an expertise, and they let you really kind of focus. They let you become kind of a specialist in one area of law. It's not a state bar recognized specialty, but when you're doing just one kind of case every single day, you learn every nuance of that area of the law, the difference between a first degree murder and a second degree murder, and how immunity would work. And you really immerse yourself in all things. All things that subject matter. So in homicide, you're immersed in all things brutal death, from decomposition to autopsies. And in doing trial after trial, you get a unique sense of what a jury is going to respond to, what the court will allow, what's going to survive on appeal. All of these considerations, which for the victims of violent crime really is critically important, because the worst thing that can happen, especially to a family that loses a loved one, is to go through an entire process just to have the case get reversed on appeal. That's awful.
So, Matt was called that morning because of the serious nature of the case, but also as a homicide prosecutor, investigators didn't know if Michael would survive his injuries.
Did they think that he possibly might not survive? So that's why they called you?
Well, yeah, he was in severe shock. I think he was suffering from exposure. This was but he'd been beaten, he'd been burnt with a blowtorch, he had bleach torn all over him, and he was in horrific shock. So he was definitely this is definitely a incredibly dangerous, precarious position that they'd left this man in. So yeah, I got the call because it could have easily turned into a homicide if he didn't survive, which is when you want to get brought in as a homicide prosecutor.
Meantime, in the desert, first responders formed a massive grid search.
First responders or volunteers or whoever literally lock arms and walk through an area where everybody's eyes are on the ground looking for something. Sometimes they'll do that for pieces of evidence that are missing. And this, of course, was, the hopes were that they could recover this man's penis so it could be reattached. So that's ongoing when I get brought into the case. And so as the minutes are ticking by on that, we're realizing the worst scenario, that these guys not only sexually mutilated him, but they took it with them to ensure that it could never be reattached.
Investigators in Newport Beach went to Michael's home and began searching for clues. Inside the home, it was clear it was a very focused and violent scene. They found a bloody comforter, and there was blood on the couch. But this was all Michael's blood. Remember, the intruders had worn gloves and masks, which meant it was highly unlikely that there would be physical evidence left behind by the suspects to help point them in the direction of who had done this. The why, even early on in the investigation, seemed pretty obvious. Money. The intruders clearly believed that Michael had $1 million in cash, either stashed in the house or in the desert. They wonder if this had been a home invasion robbery gone wrong. But Michael's sexual mutilation, while the others cheered on, felt personal. Another clue, and it was a big one, Michael's legal marijuana dispensary business was successful, which in 2012 was a problem.
There's no provision for how the business would actually be conducted other than licensing and that they want taxes. Tons and tons of media about how great it was going to be and how it was going to increase the state coffers and blah, 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 without anybody ever stopping to think that, hey, this is still a federal crime.
So the sale of medical marijuana was legal in California at the state level, but because it wasn't legal at a federal level, that meant banks didn't want any part of that business.
So the F in the FDIC that we see on the front of every bank stands for federal, and the cultivation, distribution, or sale of marijuana is still a federal crime. So what that means is no banks will work with marijuana dispensaries, they were called back then. Now, now they're just I mean, I guess the name may have survived a little bit. They're dispensaries. I think people still call them that, but basically weed shops. So at the end of every day, you have a pile of cash. It's an all cash business. People who buy it in bulk or buy it for a lot, I guess they have no particular desire for it to wind up on their bank card, but mostly it's just they can't bank. The businesses can't bank. There's no state banks, or at least there weren't in 2012, that they could use to properly record all these business transactions. So at the end of every day, you've got a pile of money.
Now, that might sound like a good problem to have, but not when you fully understand the dynamics of this burgeoning legal weed business in 2012.
When California began to take steps to make it towards the legalization of marijuana, legitimate business people wanted a piece of that action. So they came in and it's a completely different group.
The effectiveness of legit weed sellers was having an effect on the bottom line of drug dealers who weren't happy about it.
So basically you have this bizarre conflict where businesses coming in, the legalization of what are known as hydroponic grows or indoor water-based marijuana grows, it's so much more controlled. The level of THC is so high now in marijuana. And what happened is these guys would come in and they would honor their contracts and they would do their licenses, and they were properly, they would do everything right. They would pay their fees. They would pay people the fair wage. They would pay what they agreed to pay. And what that did is that put an incredible amount of pressure on the violent criminal element in the marijuana world. And it began lowering their margins and kind of squeezing them out. So you've got a bunch of crooks, basically, who are not shy of violence, who are getting, or their revenue's drying up. And they've got these usurpers, they would almost view them, running these very successful businesses who at the end of every day have a pile of cash.
As soon as Michael was able, investigators went to the hospital to interview him.
The first interview with him, the very first question is, hey, who would want to do this to you? And he had no idea. And he's like, and basically it's like, I have not had an affair. I haven't slept with somebody's wife. I've paid all my bills. I'm properly licensed. I'm doing this right. And our victim very much was one of those business guys that came in. In fact, he didn't even use marijuana himself. So it's like he was one of the clean people doing it right. And, so he was talking within 12 hours, they were getting information from him, but essentially it was just a bunch of question marks. It was, I have no enemies. I have no idea who'd want to do this. I haven't ripped anybody off. I haven't done anything wrong. I have no idea. I didn't recognize any of the voices. I don't know. And that's where the investigation began.
Mary's actions were heroic in getting help for Michael. But when it came to the investigation, because she was blindfolded, she couldn't really help fill out any more details as to who the suspects could be.
So she's able to describe all this information, but had no idea who might have done it. She never saw anything. They were blindfolded. She never saw anybody's face. She had virtually nothing that could really help other than describe the horror of what they had gone through on this trip out to the desert.
Now, even though Michael said he had no enemies, clearly someone felt they were close enough to him to believe he had a lot of cash on hand. At the time, Michael owned 3 weed dispensaries. And one thing investigators knew about the medical marijuana industry in 2012 was that it had attracted the cartel. And what had been done to Michael was so brutal. It had to be in retaliation for something Michael had done to someone. Because this kind of crime, cutting off a man's penis, and the extra level of cruelty to take the appendage with them, what had Michael done to cause someone to be that enraged?
Any narcotics detective in California will tell you that some of the biggest investors in these marijuana dispensaries are Mexican drug cartels. So this is, there's a lot of problems with that business. I have no problem with anybody that wants to, use marijuana for personal use, but there's a business side of this and a danger to a lot of these things that just hasn't been adequately addressed. So that's the background of this.
Since investigators didn't have any physical evidence, like DNA, Tying these suspects to the crime, they began to develop theories about who these men could potentially be. They appeared to be sophisticated because they'd gotten into the home undetected, poured bleach on Michael in what appeared to be an effort to get rid of any DNA evidence that might have been left on him. And they wore gloves and masks. But there was also this level of sadistic violence targeted towards Michael that felt outside of what criminals out to rob someone would do.
You track back and you're thinking, why did this happen? The fact that Michael was the target, it seemed, because this seems like, it's a clue in and of itself. What would make someone want to do this? What did he do something to someone? This isn't something you just do in a smash and grab.
I prosecuted 13 different cases where the defendant could be classified as a serial killer. Okay, and some of them were Rodney Alcala, who represented himself, also known as the dating game killer, or I had the Golden State Killer for a while. And both of those were horrific, depraved animals, essentially, that what they did was, disturbing. But this is when the information began coming in about this, and the woman, Mary Barnes, began describing what they were demanding. These guys were after money. So this wasn't like a depraved serial killer motivated by whatever motivates serial killers. This was an organized, meticulous conspiracy where not only did they torture this poor guy, they did it, and they decided that that's a different level of cruelty. So that you're talking about a young man and they removed his penis. So you're talking about somebody that has all the sexual drive, all the hormones, all the urges. You had a beautiful young fiance at the time, and they've sexually, essentially crippled this man for the rest of his life. And yes, that is a different level.
Without much to go on, they hit the neighborhood, hoping to find an eye or ear witness.
Canvas is basically where you've kind of hit a dead end, and it's a due diligence thing where you just start knocking on doors. And they send, police officers out to knock on the doors of the neighbors to see if they have heard anything or saw anything that maybe help along the investigation. And what almost always happens in a canvas is you hear all kinds of stuff, and of course the neighbors want to help, and you wind up getting a bunch of stuff that has nothing to do with your investigation, and they tend to suck up a lot of resources. So it's like you'll get, I heard a noise down by down the street. I heard some crazy sounds, but it could be the raccoons in the trash can again, or, yeah, I did, and they'll point to the different direction. I heard a woman screaming, but it could have been my neighbor fighting with his wife again. So you get people that want to supply information. They just don't have anything that's helpful. And
I don't know if you caught that, but Matt said what almost always happens in the canvas is that they're a resource suck. But on the last house they went to in the neighborhood, one that was behind Michael's home and across an alley, they spoke to a woman who often looked out the window of her home and paid attention to the goings-on in the neighborhood.
There's an alley, and then there's neighbors on the other side of the alley, and they knock on one of those doors, and a woman answers the door who said, I did see something strange. I saw these boys with hard hats that appeared to be too new, and she's like, it didn't look right to me, and it was a white truck, and it had a dent on it, and they're like, please tell us you can give us some additional description. And she's like, well, I wrote the license plate down. Will that help? So that was one of those.
How rare is that?
Never happens. It just never happens. It never happens. And she wrote the license plate down of this truck. And, this was one of those breaks that, an investigation like this, I don't think we ever would have figured this out if it hadn't been for that.
The neighbor also told police that she'd seen 3 men dressed like construction workers in that white truck, and she watched as they put a ladder up against Michael's house and went inside. But 2 of them never came back out.
The license plate, when we ran it, it came back to a guy named Kyle Hanley, and his license plate came right back to his house in Fountain Valley, California.
They put surveillance on Kyle's home, and they found that he rarely left the house, and when he did, he seemed nervous. Investigators plan to have a uniformed police officer pull Kyle over for a traffic stop when a detective working the case goes up to his vehicle and says, "I'd like to talk to you about a home invasion in Newport Beach." It was at that point that Kyle's face drained of color. He started immediately sweating and asked for a lawyer. A search warrant was approved for Kyle's house. They found multiple receipts for hydroponic supplies, and the attic was outfitted to grow marijuana. Investigators also have a search warrant for his white truck, the one with the big dent on the side that the neighbor had identified.
First thing they do when they open the truck is they smell the overpowering odor of bleach. They get in, they find a sweatshirt of his with little, like, it looks like bleach drops.
Like splash.
And like as if it has been splashed with bleach. They find zip ties in the house, very consistent with the ones that were used to tie up Michael and Mary. So, and then we find one on a plastic bag in the backyard, and then a further search of his truck revealed a blue nitrile glove that we submitted to the crime lab for testing. So we submitted the zip tie found on the trash bag for genetic testing, and we submitted this nitrile glove found in his truck for genetic testing.
Detectives ask Michael if he knows a Kyle Handley, and he's like, "Yes, I do know him."
So now we've got our first connection to the marijuana world. And Kyle had been a grower that Michael had purchased marijuana product from before. And in fact, then Michael said that they'd had a successful year the year before, and he actually took Kyle and a bunch of other people that were a part of the business, like, people that were growers or people that were somehow connected. They had a great year, so he had a party in Vegas, and he invited Kyle out and he paid for his room. So, and again, all cash business. So I can only imagine that what Kyle saw was our victim with cash, because again, it's all cash.
Kyle would be arrested, and it would take a few weeks, but DNA would finally come back on those gloves that were found in his truck.
Lo and behold, we get a hit on the nitrile glove to a guy named Hussein Nairi. Nairi's DNA in the glove, and then we've got an unknown male DNA on the zip tie, who is neither Kyle Handley nor Nairi, but we know that there's 3 men involved in the kidnapping. So now, next question, the hot question of that moment was, where is Hussein Nairi? And we learned very quickly that he has fled back to his native country of Iran. So now our mastermind, or who appears to be our mastermind, is in the one country in the world that will literally never extradite one of their citizens to the United States.
Next time on Criminal Mischief with Carolyn and Branden, Part 2 of Wanton Cruelty. When it all seemed hopeless, a light bulb moment would change everything.
So she shows up and basically signs a form indicating that she is aware of all the contents and they belong to her, and she's essentially signs a document indicating that she was a full-blown co-conspirator, based on, and they had her read it right in front of them. And so
that was a checkmate move. Was that who orchestrated that? Because that's really powerful to get her to flip.
Yeah, really, really good detectives and really good police work.
Up next, Criminal Mischief bonus content. Here, my co-host Branden Morgan and I discuss the case in more detail. And hey, guess what? We're on YouTube. So please go check us out and subscribe to the show. And as always, thanks for listening. From Cloud 10, Criminal Mischief is a pie-in-the-sky production recorded in the beautiful Pacific Northwest. We're produced by Branden Morgan and myself, music by Soundstripe. I'm Carolyn Osorio, your writer and host.